Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today in the video we're going to talk about migrating Logic App connections to DevOps. This is really coming up from a question from one of my YouTube subscribers who asked about a previous video I've done. So we'll go through that question today. Before we jump into today's video, a quick thanks to our sponsors, Serverless 360, who are helping us grow the channel. So check out their product if you're interested in things like cost analysis of your Azure spend. You're looking for opportunities to reduce the amount of money you spend and optimize those resources and just get those costs transparent and under control. Check out business applications if you're looking to provide better monitoring and management of the solution that you're building in Azure. If you're looking for things like business self-service for transactions executing on your integration platform, whether it be Power Automate, Logic Apps, Azure functions, or some other technologies, check out Business Activity Monitoring and Azure Document that can help you automate documentation generation from the solution you've built in the cloud. Back to today's video. So the problem statement was that we've got a resource group here. Let me get my pen. Right, so we've got an existing subscription and resource group. We've got loads of APIs and logic apps in here. Each of these has got an API connection. So let's imagine we have some of these go out to Dropbox. Some may go to Service Bus. Some may go to SQL. Now, we keep this fairly simple on the diagram here, but actually in the real world, we may have a scenario where, let's say we've got 250 logic apps, was I think how many the person who asked the question raised, and these logic apps probably have, maybe 10 connections that talk to Dropbox. You might have 50 that talk to Service Bus and 20 that talk to SQL, and then you're going to have loads of other connections down here used by different logic apps. So that's the environment that they've built over time. They've then got some of these logic apps would be built with ARM templates. Some of them would have been direct in the portal. And then that would have kind of by proxy created the API connections. Now, that's kind of evolved over time. They're now in a situation where they need to set a new environment up. So we've got environment 2, let's pretend that's system test or something like that. And because the DevOps investment here had been limited, so maybe we've done a little bit of DevOps, when we have to go and migrate from dev to system test, the question's, well, how do I recreate all this stuff, but with different parameters for different SQL databases and all that stuff? And this really is, it's a very common problem where people have just thought about the development environment and not later in the life cycle. And then you've got everything deployed and working, but how do you now replicate that across other environments? But then in this scenario, we've also got this big scale where there's actually lots of integrations. So the problem's quite challenging. Now, the two videos that I've done previously, so here we've got the one about logic app consumption with Terraform. So this was, the idea was, if you've built a logic app in the portal, how do you bring it into a repo and then bring it into a DevOps process? So you've got various things around ARM templates, which I think get really complicated. And we had that ARM client tool, and it just gets really messy. So that video about Terraform talked about a much simpler script where we're extracting just the workflow JSON, and then we're able to very easily parameterize it without all the extra ARM sort of fluff that makes it more complicated. And I found that was quite a good way, especially for complicated logic apps that had been built in the portal. For me, it was easier to parameterize them and get them into DevOps. We then had this second video where we went beyond a simple logic app, and we started looking at one that was using things like SQL connectors, I think you can kind of see, if I can draw into the video, I can't go over that widget. So you can see in the video there, you've got the SQL connector and the function connector. In the second video, I looked at a wider scenario covering other dependencies, which really sort of brings Terraform into its own, I think, being able to reference and set up the other resources beyond the logic app. Now, one of the things that I did in these videos was here, where I was setting up the connections. I was using what's called Azure API provider in Terraform, and that worked really well because I was kind of setting up new stuff. But when the person asking the question has 250 logic apps with probably an equal number of connections, I would guess, they're probably going to have the AZ API providers. You're going to have to import the state of all of them into your Terraform, and then kind of go through the deployment process. That's going to be quite a big exercise, and I think there's a better way of doing this. And I think that's what I'm going to go through in this video. And also, I think the approach I'll talk about, I'll give you the opportunity to centralize the connection setup. So what we're going to do is, I think I've talked a bit about the gap actually. So we're going to look to see if we can centralize connection setup. We're going to then, in the logic app, you would just reference by name. And then hopefully when you've got that centralized connection setup, I'm going to show a way that you can sort of use a module in Terraform that'll let you define a connection, and then you can basically just create instances of it very easily. So I think spinning up these 250 connections, you'll basically create a module for each type of connection. So maybe you have one for, in this case, I'm going to use one for SQL or managed identity, one for SQL with a connection string. Maybe you have one for service bus, and then if I need 10 service bus connections, I can just call that module 10 times, and that's where it'll make creating that large number of connections much easier. So that's where I'm hoping the win's going to come in, using the Terraform modules. So let's have a look at the code for this now. So here's my solution. I'm going to put this into a Git repo so everybody can sort of have a look at it. And the key bits are, so I've got my modules here. So I've created this folder structure where I've got modules, connections, ARM, SQL, and in here I've got I've got two kind of, I guess if you define these, think of these a bit like defining a class, and then I'm going to reuse it. So this here will allow me to use an ARM deployment. So in Terraform, we've got this thing called a resource group template deployment, where I can define an ARM template here and then deploy it from Terraform. So what I've done here, this is the one that does the SQL connection. So you can see I've got things like the location, the name, and I can pretty much get this from the Azure portal. One of the limitations in the Azure portal that I think you'll find is that it doesn't always, when you export it, give you these settings here. For some reason, they've decided that you have to do that bit yourself, and there's no option to turn it on. So usually, I think people quite often just go into the browser's network trace, and you can see what it looks like when you create a connection. It's the easiest way to get these. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just create this sort of module which will deploy a SQL connection, and I'm going to pass in some parameters. So you can see these parameters get specified up here in this parameters content. And then what I've done in my module, I've just created a main.tf where I've declared all of the variables that are going to get sent in. Now, for the SQL connection with MSI, it'll basically be exactly the same, only the connection's a bit simpler. So here I just specify the auth managed identity, and I don't need as many parameters because the rest of them will come from the logic app itself. I can then now go and use these two files here to deploy my connection. So what I'm going to do here, as you can see, I'm defining the use of a module which points to my modules, connections, ARM, SQL, MSI. And in Terraform, you can do a for each here. So I'm going to define a variable up here which is basically a list of connection names, and I'm gonna pass in, here's going to create 3 connections for me, and I'll just basically pass in the resource group, the deployment name, the location, and the connection name. And when I run Terraform, what that'll do is it'll run this module 3 times, once for each of these connection names here, and that'll go and spin up dynamically 3 connections in Azure. It'll basically run 3 ARM deployments, and then it'll create those connections, and then I'll have just specified the location, the name, and I'll be able to reference them then from my logic apps. Now we'll basically get the same thing here for the SQL connector, where I want to use the connection string instead, but the thing that's slightly different this time is I need a few more settings. So instead of just a simple string array of connection names, I'm going to use an object, like array inside a locals element in Terraform. So here I've defined each object as basically the settings for a given connector. So I'm going to pass in the name, the server name, the database, the username, the password, and these I'm just going to get from key vaults. Now, because it's just a demo, each of these connections is going to use the same database, but if I had connection 2 going to a different database, I could just specify a different server name and database, etc. And then what I would do here is I'm gonna reference my modules for ARM connections built from an ARM template with SQL with a connection string. The bit that's different, because I'm using the object above rather than just a simple array, I have to do a count. So this is going to create 1 Terraform object for each item in the above array of objects. And then what I'm going to do here, as you can see, I'm passing in here the server name, the database, the username, etc. And then here with Terraform, I'm just kind of, with a connection name, I've got like a standard prefix I'm configuring. And you can see I'm just passing in the name here later on. So that'll allow me to just easily have some common standards if I use my if I want to have like a standard prefix or something. Now, the good bit about this, if you think of that thing I said before about centralizing connection deployment, that can then be reused by 1 or more logic apps. What I can do if I need to add a new connection, so let's imagine I've got this deployed out, I've got a pipeline that deploys it. I need a new API connection, so I'll just go and add a new one to the array, and I might say this one's called SQL to I don't know, to the HR system database. I can create that connection, I can set these properties here, and then just run the Terraform. It deploys the connection, and then I would go and deploy it across different environments just with a DevOps pipeline that runs by Terraform, and it would just drop some standard parameters in for each environment. So that would be, here I've got my parameters that would be for when I run it locally on my dev box, but at deployment time I would just be replacing these parameters just like any other Terraform deployment, inject them in from key vaults or from your DevOps pipeline variables or something like that. And the rest of the Terraform solution's really just standard Terraform. I've got data elements for my resource group and my key vault. The key bit here is just these connections. So if I go in my resource group, I'm just going to go and clean out the connections that I've got there. Right, so I should be able to run this now. I think I've got 3 connections for each, so this should go and build a new set of connections for me. Oh, we're not. We're in the wrong. There we go. That should be better. So what's worth noting is, because behind the scenes we're using an ARM deployment with Terraform just sat on top of it, that's where the ARM deployments will be very simple. It's just deploying 1 resource, but it'll see it as a change all the time. It'll not be that it's it shouldn't be deleting and renaming it unless you change the deployment name. So you'll notice here in there it'll go and if you change the name, it'll actually probably undeploy and redeploy. But if you just keep the name the same all the time, it'll just be constantly doing an incremental update for it. Right, so that should have deployed a bunch of connectors there. So you can see here we've got the connections that we've deployed. You can see they've got their properties all configured and everything. Now let's just imagine I create a logic app. So it's a consumption one we're doing here. So we'll just flip that over. Need North Europe, I think. So if I go and into my designer for the logic app now, so you can see it's already picked up my connection that we created before. And I've got all these ones available. So this is where I think when the person who asks the question is going to do their deployments, they'll be able to extract the logic apps, and if they've already pre-deployed the connectors, as long as they've got the right names, the logic apps that you're already using, if you're just deploying the workflow, it'll just pick the connectors up that are already there. So that should be good. Now there's one thing I just want to make people aware of who are watching the video here. So if you're doing the logic app deployment here, this is where the difference between AZ API and in this case this resource group template deployment. Now in the previous video, I think I'll bring in the code repo for this. So we use this folder in my code repo, and here we're deploying a connector where we use that AZ API resource. Now the thing here is that you're going to have to deploy this resource to your environment, but when you're developing your Terraform, you're probably going to develop against the environment that already exists potentially. So you're going to have problems at this point with importing the resources that are already there. So you're going to basically have to import all of the different resources, which I think is going to get really painful. If you were starting with a brand new connector without any deployment already in an environment, I think it will probably be easier to do this AZ API resource, and you can basically do exactly what I've done with the module, where you create that reusable module for each connector and just reduce the amount of parameters that you need to supply, so it gets a bit easier. But I think because you're in a brownfield situation where you've got existing connectors already deployed in certain places, I think that the difference here is the AZ API would be managing the resource, whereas the resource group deployment template actually manages a deployment. So if we go back, if I go and look here, what you would see is the bit Terraform's actually managing is this bit here. It's managing this resource here. Now, a good example to show how that happens is if I go back here and add delete this one resource here, and if I run the Terraform again, it won't actually see that it's been deleted because the deployment still exists. So those are the two kind of different things. What in that case, what you would need to do is either change the name of the deployment, or you would need to change maybe you change a tag on it. Would be a good example. So what you might do is maybe put like a tags element here and have it so it'll do a refresh every single time, would be quite a good way of doing it. So I'll add that bit in. So we'll see here, it's going to try and change it each time because it's going to like do an update, but it'll see the deployment already. Sorry, let me get this right. It'll see the deployment already exists and it should bomb out. That's what was happening before anyway, but it's the subtle difference between the two anyway. So I'll just put a couple of notes on that on the blog post I'll share alongside the video. But I think the key bit I wanted to get across for the questions specifically answered is I think this will be quite a good way to bulk deploy a lot of connections, and you would just create one folder under these modules for each of the different types of connections that you want, and you'd kind of go from there. Would be quite good. Actually, I think the error I created before, if I remember, I'll just have another go at trying to create this. I think what I did was let me just check that. So I deleted the connection. I can't remember now. I think I've deleted. I ended up having to delete the deployments to run it. But anyway, that you know, we'll look at that in a separate video maybe. But the key bit, just bulk deploying all these connectors to set up those 250 connectors. I think this will help you out. Hope everybody finds this video useful. Feel free to ask questions. I've got another couple of people who've asked questions I'm going to share videos about. So feel free to reach out if you want some tips and advice. Please like and subscribe to the video, and hopefully we'll have more cool stuff coming this year.